Welcome to all of you from around the world and to today's conference of the International Schiller Institute. Let us join hands with the global majority to create a new chapter in world history. This is panel one of that conference, the strategic situation after the historic BRICS summit. We want to welcome particularly those from Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, who comprise the BRICS nations, as well as those from the BRICS Plus, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Argentina, and the many other nations that will soon join the BRICS Association, as well as the other nations that are also attending these proceedings today. We began with a performance by the Schiller Institute's New York chorus of the African-American spiritual, I Don't Feel No Ways Tired. The soloist was tenor Reginald Bucknight. The first line of that song, I am seeking for a city into the kingdom, and I don't feel no ways tired, well describes the life and work of the late American statesman and economist Lyndon LaRouche, a co-founder of the Schiller Institute. LaRouche proposed to end the injustice of centuries of colonialism by a revolution, a massive program in technology transfer to what was then called in the 1970s the Third World. This, LaRouche said, was the fastest way to also economically straighten out the problems of the United States, Europe, and the transatlantic world. He described his plan back in June 1978 in his first campaign for the Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States.
What are we going to do? We're going to build new plexes. We lay it out to them. How do you build a new plex? Well, you go out and you dig a big crater. You lay a big footing, unless you've got bedrock, which you even that off. You don't even care what the terrain is like. Makes no difference. Wherever you are, blast it out, build a crater. Build a crater covering an area the size of a city of 500,000 people or 100,000 people. But build a crater for an industrial city of a new type on an area that size. All right, 6, 7, 8 stories below the surface. Build it up. Build up to the surface. On this thing, stick 2 nuclear plants, 0.5 gigawatt to 2 gigawatts each. You get a balanced load. String industries around this, using this energy to cut load distribution costs, like charm bracelets. Well, let's put a chemical industry here, that's the good thing. Let's have desalination here, so forth. Using the waste heat and the electrical power. Build housing for the families, modern housing to last 100 years. For the families of the people who are going to be brought in to do the construction, which will be done, completed within a period of 4 to 6 years. Build the on-site cultural ed program. Schools, universities, technical schools. Everything that a city requires. And when the project is completed, at the end of 6 years, these people occupy the factories because they've been educated. And gradually the Europeans and others who have been phased in, phase out, except for a few key technicians. The city then is built, it's modular, you can change it, you can develop it with no big cost. Its transportation systems are built in and modular for the next 100 years for any technological improvements which will be significant in the next 100 years. The city functions. City builds. Now, 4 to 6 years. We're going to build hundreds of these in the next 25 years. Hundreds of them. Hundreds of new cities throughout the world, especially in the developing sector. These cities will be linked together. They will form a network of high technology culture, planted in the middle of the rest of the population. And from these cities and through these cities and their universities and technical schools and technical services to the surrounding area, we'll lift one generation of the human race up from barbarism and oppression into modern life. And it would, in the next 25 years following that, we'll complete the job. And within 50 years from now, the human race will be transformed as we city builders intend to do it. We're going to mobilize every industry that exists, that's viable, and every one that can be created to do this. We're not going to export a few $10, $20 billion worth of additional exports. We're going to export hundreds of cities.
That was LaRouche's vision of how to end colonialism 50 years ago. To finance this, LaRouche had also proposed that instead of the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank as the sources of the funds for this, a new institution, an International Development Bank, would finance the reconstruction of the world economy, but in a unique way. Here's what LaRouche wrote about it. If, as is necessary for global development, the developing nations exploit their petroleum, natural gas, coal, and mineral raw materials resources to the extent required for industrial expansion in both the industrialized and developing sectors, how shall we determine both the price of those resources and the compensation for the implied depletion of such assets? Without a brute force commitment to the development of controlled thermonuclear reactions technology, there is no price level or forward depletion compensation which could be considered equitable. The general basis for treaty agreements covering prices and depleting compensation is fundamentally, number one, a commitment to applicable CTR technology installations proliferating from 1985 onwards, and two, a commitment to bring those regions up to the level of employment of controlled thermonuclear reaction-oriented technology by the 1985 to 1990 period. The important idea here is that it is not money, but technology transfer, as expressed in cutting-edge, high-energy density physical production, designed to improve the productivity and the lives of an expanding workforce in mining, manufacturing, agriculture, and essential infrastructure, including in the fields of health and education, that LaRouche envisioned as the fundamental purpose and even, in a sense, as the currency of his International Development Bank. For well over a year now, particularly after the onset of the NATO-instigated war with Russia, including its escalating threat of thermonuclear annihilation, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and leader of the Schiller Institute, has insisted in various ways and proposals, including in her 10 principles for a new strategic and development architecture, that the moment would come when the world would be brought to a punctum saliens, to the point of a potential change such that the aspirations of the majority of the human race could overcome and supersede the lawless rule of law that presently dominates. To discuss what is to be done in the aftermath of the recent August 22nd to 25 BRICS meeting to make that potential into a reality in these best and worst of times, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Helga Zepp-LaRouche, founder and head of the Schiller Institute. Her topic, BRICS, a transformation greater than that of the end of the Cold War.
Well, hello, I greet you wherever you may be around the globe. It is most urgent that we make the ordinary citizen of European nations and the USA, who are bombarded on a daily basis with a barrage of news in the mainstream mass media, which all have generally a spin in such a way as to create an almost entirely fictitious parallel reality, aware of the tectonic change going on in this historic moment. Because only if they, the ordinary citizen, recognize the choices clearly lying ahead of us is their hope for a positive way out of the present existential crisis of humanity. It is high time to review the success and respectively failure of the official policies of the recent period in order to assess the validity or flaws of one's own thinking and axioms of thinking. If there is one lesson about how it came to 2 world wars in the 20th century, then it is the number of miscalculations on the part of the participants in those wars. Having that parallel in mind, one can only sound the alarm bells in the shrillest way possible. The geopolitical confrontation of the US-led NATO over Ukraine, which did not start unprovoked on February 23rd, 2022, but really already with the Orange Revolution financed by the NED, the National Endowment of Democracy, in 2004, and which escalated with Victoria Nuland's Maidan coup in 2014. This is clearly not working the way it was intended. The unprecedented series of sanctions did not ruin Russia, as Annalena Baerbock had wished, but caused a far-reaching reorientation of Russia to the east and to the south, and it cemented the relationship between Russia and China, which clearly could not have been in the intention of the authors of this war. But also Russia's expectation about the short-term nature of the military special operation did not materialize, since the Russian leadership obviously underestimated the effect of NATO operations in Ukraine since the Maidan coup and the subsequent changed attitude of the population, as well as the far-reaching willingness for military engagement in Ukraine by the entire West. Now a military stalemate has been reached, and the continuation of the military operation can, despite all the weapons delivered, only lead to the complete attrition of human resources of Ukraine, who already have suffered horrendous casualty figures, and the danger of an escalation to a nuclear level if either Russia sees its territorial integrity threatened or somebody thinks that a limited nuclear war is feasible. If the Europeans believed that their giving in to the demands of ever more weapons to Ukraine would lead to a victory of Ukraine on the battlefield, that also did not work out. Instead, European nations find themselves completely cut off from any ties with their neighbor, and it will remain the neighbor, and the energy dependency shifted from Russia to the much more expensive American energy. And in the meantime, Germany has lost even the appearance of a remnant of sovereignty, and with it, respect in the whole world. Germany, the erstwhile economic powerhouse of Europe, is rapidly undergoing a process of deindustrialization caused by exorbitant energy prices provided by the wonderful protective power and ally United States, who is not hesitating to lure the better German industries to resettle in the US with the help of the Inflation Reduction Act, not even to mention the Nord Stream pipelines, about which nobody believes the belatedly made-up story about the sailing yacht Andromeda. A popular saying these days is, "What do you need enemies for with friends like this?" Germany has been transformed into a doormat, trampled upon by NATO boots, while the present political leadership with its green Atlanticist ideology, for whom it would be a euphemism to call it German, is gambling away about everything all the generations have built up from the rubble fields after the Second World War. Half of the German Mittelstand, the source of the entire social system in the country, is either going bankrupt or leaving to reinvest either in the US or in China. The overwhelming mood in the country is one of desperation. Restaurant owners, farmers, craftsmen, store owners, nurses, all kinds of service industries, all feel that the floor is being pulled away from under them. And those who do not want to move to the Alternative for Germany, a right-wing party with some good points, but also unacceptable elements in it, feel that they have no place to turn to. Everything will crash against the wall is one of the most heard sentences in many private discussions. People feel completely betrayed. We should remember that it was that utter feeling of betrayal after the Versailles Treaty which was the death knell for the Weimar Republic and everything which followed. But what most citizens of the West have no inkling about is that there is a much bigger, much more consequential development taking place elsewhere, in those parts of the world which are affected by what is going on between NATO and Russia, where the so-called collateral damage, such as high energy, food and energy prices in these countries, was considered negligible. And now that oversight is turning out to be the biggest misjudgment of all. The unilateral and therefore illegal sanctions against Russia and a whole series of other countries, the confiscation of state assets and the weaponization of the dollar on top of the long-standing experience of unfair trade and credit conditions have led to a gigantic blowback in the countries of the global south, which since have emerged as the global majority, representing more than 85% of the world population. The massive attempts by NATO countries to pressure countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa to take the side of the democracies of the rules-based order against the supposed autocracies and dictatorships in the Ukraine conflict backfired thoroughly. The identity of these countries as being part of the non-aligned movement and the spirit of Bandung, the major alliance between Asian and African countries of the 1955 conference, came back to life, and with it the memory that it was the Soviet Union which had helped many of the developing countries in their struggle for independence against the colonial powers. When Lyndon LaRouche, my late husband, had first proposed the alternative to the IMF in the form of the IDB, which would not have the conditionalities of the IMF, which was intended to issue $400 billion credit lines per year for industrial development projects. This proposal was full-heartedly endorsed by the non-aligned movement then, who incorporated it in their final resolution in Colombo, Sri Lanka, representing already then 75% of the world population. The reactions of the financial powers were brutal. Indira Gandhi and Mrs. Bandaranaike were ousted from power. President Ali Bhutto and Prime Minister Indira Gandhi several years later were assassinated. The non-aligned movement played a subdued role for many years to come as a result of these attacks. Lyndon LaRouche, whose 101st birthday we were celebrating yesterday, and his international movement kept writing development plans relentlessly. A comprehensive infrastructure plan for the entire African continent, presented in 1976 in a conference in Paris. Operation Juarez for Latin America in cooperation with Mexican President López Portillo. A 50-year development plan for the Pacific Basin in light of the expected increase of population density in that part of the world. A 40-year development plan for India, which Mrs. Gandhi started to implement. The Oasis Plan for Southwest Asia. And in 1991, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, the Eurasian Land Bridge. The New Silk Road. All of these programs were presented at literally hundreds of conferences and seminars on 5 continents. After President Xi Jinping presented the concept of the new Silk Road in Kazakhstan exactly 10 years and 2 days ago, Western governments, think tank, and media amazingly ignored this program, which was clearly the largest infrastructure program in history ever, easily an order of magnitude larger than the Marshall Plan for Europe after the Second World War. But for the countries of the Global South, the Belt and Road Initiative became the game changer, allowing many of them for the first time to seriously launch infrastructure programs, industrial parks, advanced science projects, etc. From the end of 2017, the attitude in the West towards the BRI suddenly shifted from indifference to hostility. In the security papers of the Pentagon first, and then synchronized in all Western media and think tanks, China's rise was characterized as systemic rival and opponent, culminating in the recent decoupling and de-risking frenzy. When the recent enlargement of the BRICS into BRICS 11 and the expressed interest of around 40 more countries to join likewise, the idea of a complete decoupling from Russia and China is more than absurd. It is suicidal. The perspective of creating 2 more or less separate blocks in reality is not feasible and can only be seen as the futile effort to economically weaken an adversary before a planned military attack, which, given the existence of several thousand nuclear missiles, would mean the annihilation of the human species and with it all life on Earth. It is time for a fundamental strategic re-evaluation. Is it now not more in the interest of the US and the European nations to take the initiative to cooperate with all the countries of the Global South and build a prosperous world for all nations, rather than taking the risk of pursuing a policy which may lead to the end of history, albeit in a different way than Francis Fukuyama, the father of all political misjudgments, fantasized? News are coming this morning that Prime Minister Modi announced in a long overdue step at the ongoing G20 summit in New Delhi that the African Union has been admitted to the G20, making it the G21. That is positive, but completely insufficient. In order to eliminate the danger of a third, this time thermonuclear war, we need to create a totally new international security and development architecture, which takes into account the security and economic interest of all nations on the planet. And that is only possible if it's based on the development of all, on the interest of the other, and the creation of a common future which is promising and uplifting for all of humanity. The comprehensive study the Schiller Institute published in 2014 in response to President Xi's announcement from 2013 in Kazakhstan, the new Silk Road becomes the world land bridge, can be the basis for such a peace order of the 21st century. It gives a clear orientation for the economic build-up of all parts of the planet, concrete plans for the overcoming underdevelopment in the Global South, as well as concrete guidelines for the reconstruction of the decaying economies of the Global North. Together with the 10 principles I suggested for such a new architecture, these proposals could be the basis for any serious attempt to find a solution to the present crisis. Why not conduct a special session at the UN General Assembly to discuss such a new international architecture, when clearly so many people around the world are concerned about the threat to world peace? The idea of a world land bridge connecting all infrastructurally developed continents through tunnels and bridges, so that one can travel soon with a maglev train from the southern tip of Argentina or Chile up north through the Americas via the Bering Strait, all the way along the Trans-Siberian Railway to Gibraltar and on through Africa to the Cape of Good Hope. This will be the realization of the vision of the German economist Friedrich List and his space and time economy, where he outlined how an advanced transport and communication system with a high speed, dense regularity, and cost efficiency of infrastructure would allow for new levels of the mental and material productive powers. This development would then lead to a republic of the planet, as he called it, based on the economy of humanity, which would make it possible that all talents would exchange their ideas and work together in all areas of science and art and all areas of knowledge, which in turn would increase the efficiency of all powers of humanity, obviously the exact opposite of decoupling and de-risking. A similar idea about the future development of humanity to become a great community of the entire world, in Chinese, Datong Jishe, forgive me my pronunciation, can also find with Tsai Yuan-pei, the first education minister of the Republic of China and president of the Peking University, who introduced Schiller's conception of aesthetic education into China. Obviously, the same evolutionary innate idea governed Nicolaus of Cusa's idea about harmony in the macrocosm based on the best mutual development of all microcosms. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz's idea of a pre-established harmony in the universe represents the same idea. Vernadsky's notion of the increasing dominance of the noosphere over the biosphere as well. And I remember very well how LaRouche stunned his associates when he talked about how, despite the present importance of the sovereignty of the nation state, that would not be the last stage in the evolution of the development of humanity. Look at this latest breakthrough China made in controllable nuclear fusion technology for a new generation of an artificial sun, the Huanliu 3, a week ago. They realized high confinement mode operation with a plasma current of 1 million ampere for the first time, according to the China National Nuclear Corporation. The high confinement mode is also used as the standard mode for the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, the ITER, in Caradache in France, which is run by 7 members: China, the EU, India, Japan, Russia, South Korea, and the US. This inherently safe form of nuclear energy, once it is fully realized, is one of the technologies which will remove the basis for geopolitical rivalry, because it will make energy so plentiful and cheap that it will be cheaper than the continuation of military conflict. The perspective for a completely new paradigm in international relations is on the horizon, and this could come much faster than most can imagine. A change in the United States with the next presidential election could return the US on the path of a republic. As Sergei Glaziev indicated, a new BRICS currency will likely materialize in 2024 during Russia's chairmanship of the BRICS, which could turn out to be the lifeboat for the global financial system. So there is all the reason for a culturally optimistic view for the future of mankind, provided we replace hatred, envy, and resentment with love, generosity, and curiosity for the potential of the other cultures. we still have time to reset the axioms of our thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Helga. And if you've just joined us, we want to welcome you to today's International Schiller Institute Conference. Let us join hands with the global majority to create a new chapter in world history. This is panel one of that conference, called The Strategic Situation After the Historic BRICS Summit, which took place in August 22nd to 25th. You've just heard Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and head of the Schiller Institute, on the topic BRICS, a transformation greater than that of the end of the Cold War. Our next speaker is His Excellency Donald Ramotar of Guyana, former president of Guyana. His topic, Prospects and Challenges Post-BRICS Summit.
Thank you. Good morning from Guyana. I don't know what time it is in different parts of the world, but greetings to all of you. The just concluded BRICS conference in South Africa will certainly go down as an historic event. This is so because it would very well be the beginning of the end of neocolonialism and the advent of a new economic liberation. This is something that patriots and nationalist leaders in the global South have dreamed about for a long time. This was something that many countries and progressive leaders had been pondering for a long while. We have suffered for so long by the massive manipulation of the international institutions, such as the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and the IMF, which became instruments of oppression used by the United States. Even the United Nations itself was known to be misused and manipulated on several occasions. Example, the murder of Patrice Lumumba, and more recently, the invasion of Iraq and Libya. However, the issue that made these things possible was the use of the US dollar, or one of the things that made these possible was the use of the US dollar as the preeminent currency to carry out international trade. That gave the United States authorities enormous power and influence in the global economy as a whole. The US used its positions in the international economy to impose its positions, political and otherwise, on other states. If it did not like the policy of any country, it was quick to impose sanctions on those states. The longest sanctions have been imposed on Cuba since 1961-62. This has created great hardships on the people of that island. The main objective of those sanctions was to ensure that Cuba's socialist system would not succeed. While Cuba's socioeconomic system was not destroyed, it survived all the sanctions. The economy took a battering, and it is causing great hardship to the people of that island. Over the years, this became a powerful weapon in the hands of the United States. Today, the people of Venezuela and Nicaragua are laboring under heavy sanctions. Iraq was heavily sanctioned during the time of the Saddam Hussein government, and it cost them dearly. More than 500,000 children, you will recall, died because of those sanctions. The then US Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, justified that and justified the killing of more than 500,000 children, apart from other people, that she said it was worth the while. They have seized billions of dollars from Iran, Afghanistan, and now Russia, and many other states as well. Indeed, they weaponized the dollar, using it to raid and rob other states and even individuals. They felt so sure about their ability to destroy and or inflict heavy damage on countries that they placed that in their planning to destroy Russia. So when they pushed Ukraine to provoke Russia into a conflict, they were not only depending on the military preparation that they did with Ukraine and their own military might, but also on their sanctions, the economic sanctions. Recall President Biden's boast about imposing the mother of all sanctions on Russia. They felt that Russia could not withstand such comprehensive sanctions, which included the stealing of Russia's money that were held in US banks. Russia's response showed that sanctions could be defeated. In my view, the demand by Russia to be paid in rubles for their oil and other commodities was most responsible for exposing the sanctions and making it ineffective. In fact, it was more than ineffective. It created a boomerang effect on those who placed the sanctions on her. Russia began trading with other countries using their respective currencies. The system is working. Moreover, it offers all nations a greater degree of economic freedom. And may I say in passing here that this was possible for Russia to do because of the experience that they had from the time of the Soviet Union. In one of the ways they used to help countries in the global south was to trade with them in their own currency and even allow them to pay back debts and so forth in commodities that they had plentiful. And that is something that China too has been adopting in recent times. So that is another benefit from the former Soviet Union. Other countries, including allies of the United States, have recognized this and have appreciated the wisdom of this. Added to the greater independence that it offers nations, we must also recognize that many countries became scared of the fact that the United States has been practicing seizing other people's reserves that are held in their banks. And that has spread to many European countries as well. Trading in their own currencies and eventually creating a new currency for foreign trade among BRICS nations and states is demonstrating a strong viability and a strong alternative to the system that we have at this point in time, to give us a possibility of having other currencies to trade with. This movement has great possibilities and is likely to spread even wider. Other systems are coming into existence that will facilitate this, for a want of a better word, for the independence movement, this new independence movement. This includes alternatives to the SWIFT system and other banking arrangements. The BRICS banks has the possibility of offering a new kind of relations among nations. This is particularly attractive to the global south. The win-win philosophy of China in dealing with the global south is gradually becoming a philosophy that the BRICS can adopt. While recognizing the potential that the BRICS arrangements offer, we must not allow ourselves to fall into a false sense of security. We must see this as a struggle, and the possibilities are so great that they are worth fighting for. Let us not, however, believe that it would be smooth sailing. If we agree that this would be a struggle, then we must examine the vulnerability of the BRICS and anticipate that the US and its NATO allies would strive to take advantage of anything to frustrate and defeat the movement. We must be aware that unity within the group, even on limited objectives, is most important. Without doubt, the NATO group would use any vulnerability to look and find them and to use them to disunite and to try to destroy. In the first place, and when I'm looking at some of the vulnerabilities, in the first place, I think about India. That would be a target for imperialism to work on. This is so because of the border issues that exist between China and India. That has created a lot of tensions, and the tensions have grown between those countries because of the border dispute. Another major issue is the situation in the South China Sea. The US is ensuring that the countries involved in the South China Sea are not getting together to discuss this matter among themselves to find solutions. Even a country like Vietnam, with such a glorious history, is straddling its position between China and the United States. And that is most disappointing because the United States is offering its assistance against China. The US is seeking out any country with any issue with China and Russia and offering its support to them. We see them at this moment working with Armenia, one of Russia's allies, strong allies, because of the tension it has with Azerbaijan, which is also supported by Turkey, a country that has been trying to play a middle road and a neutral road in the struggle that goes on with Ukraine at this point in time. So obviously they're trying to kill two birds with one stone here. In Latin America, we can expect massive overt and covert actions by the United States and its NATO allies to bring about regime change in many countries. Recall that Mexico expressed strong support for the BRICS initiative, and at an earlier period, it expressed its intention to join the group. It should be noted that that did not materialize, and one can speculate that it has something to do with pressures from the United States. Argentina has great internal problems. The United States has a strong influence in the military of most of the countries of the region. They have strong links within the countries, including the political parties. The government of Argentina is in a weak position. You can bet your bottom dollar that the US is going to activate contacts to bring about regime change there. And we saw the growth of the right wing in that country in the last elections. The situation is a bit better in Brazil. However, we must not forget that Lula's victory was very, very slim. Here too, we have to expect US involvement to try to remove Lula or to temper his actions. These are some of the areas that could be exploited to stem the tide that the BRICS summit in South Africa created. Our task is to minimize the issues that has a possibility to divide the BRICS movement and to maximize those that bring unity among them so that we can help this movement to grow from its infancy to become stronger. Whatever influence we have, we should force direct it towards removing the things that could be used to stymie BRICS advancement. In my opinion, the border issues are the most dangerous of all. We should encourage discussions among the BRICS states to assist in settling the contentious issues among group members. We should help to find mechanism, to make suggestion and finding some type of mechanism, because it is so difficult for countries involved in border issues to really solve them by themselves sometimes. But if we can help to find fair and just mechanism to try to help those countries to deal with those thorny issues. If we can succeed in removing those impediments, then we will be contributing to the unity of the movement, which is so essential for success and the final victory over neocolonialism. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, President Ramotar, for your remarks. If you've just joined us, welcome to today's International Schiller Institute Conference. Let us join hands with the global majority to create a new chapter in world history. This is panel one of that conference, the strategic situation after the historic BRICS summit. And you've just heard His Excellency Donald Ramotar, former president of Guyana, who was speaking on prospects and challenges post-BRICS summit. Our next speaker is Professor Georgy Toloraya of Russia, retired senior diplomat, deputy chairman of the Russian National Committee on BRICS Research. His topic, BRICS, a war prevention medicine.
Good morning. It's a great honor for me to join the conference on the global majority efforts to create a new chapter in world history. And I'm dealing with BRICS for already 13 years. And I would long have expected this day to come, the day when the BRICS would become a real actor in global politics. But I was really amazed that this day came so soon. I would say that the recent summit in late August in Johannesburg was truly a historic event. It would go in history as historic even for technical reasons, because this was the day and this was the summit when the membership in BRICS expanded twofold, which nobody, including myself, has expected. Moreover, substantially, this is truly a historic summit, because this is for the first time that the BRICS have declared itself to be on the way and being capable of creating a new world order. It's really a tide change. Now, 20 to 40 countries are interested in joining BRICS in this or that form, and this is something that nobody have expected, including myself. What happened? I think that the answer lies in the open confrontation, which started with the special military operation of Russia in Ukraine in February 2022, and it signaled the real new chapter of history when the Western countries tried to forcefully pressure the new centers of power not to allow to appear appearance of a new world order. This is a turbulent moment of history, but the result was that the majority of the countries, the global majorities, did not support these efforts by the West. although on paper and declaratory, including the United Nations, many countries do accuse Russia of aggression, but still they do not agree with the Western policies of trying to keep its dominance in the global affairs and to set the rules to all others should obey. So there's a new situation when the global majority wants a new model of international relations, which is not based on the traditional model which was used after the Second World War, when major countries, the global masters, dictate to all others what they should do. And now the countries want to have the equal partnership, to have many, maybe competing centers of power, which play their own role, think with their own head, and doing their own policies. So in the long run, it may remind something of what was in European history, the Westphalia peace system, which was based on the sovereignty of nation states, the equality, non-interference, and trying to accommodate the interests of the partners. So maybe we are on the way to a global Westphalia system. However, we shouldn't forget that the Westphalia system was the result of a 30-year war. And maybe we are in the process of such a war. And Ukraine is just the beginning. And we may have another 30 years or several decades of wars in different parts of the world before finally such a system would emerge. This is a bad scenario. However, war may not last for 30 years. It may last just for 30 minutes if the major global powers would just launch their nuclear ballistic missiles, and the war will be over in 30 minutes. This will be the end of the world. We shouldn't, of course, agree to this either. So the only way is to find a way to negotiate, to try to find a solution before it comes to this. And for this, I think the crucial thing is the change in the Western policies. Global majority doesn't want to accept the policy of dominance, of dictate, of sanctions, of interference into internal affairs, of de facto robbery when the national assets are being confiscated voluntarily and unilaterally. So it's not the Russia or China which are isolated, which here often in different West-sponsored forum. It's rather the Western countries that are isolated. And BRICS, during this meeting, during the summit meeting, has shown its desire to accommodate the West. BRICS is not anti-Western. It's not against US as a country. It's not against the Western civilization. It's not against the Europe. BRICS has an open arm to cooperate with these countries, to include them. BRICS is an inclusive structure. And so it's open to dialogue, it's open to cooperation, but not on the terms of master and servant, on the equal terms. And that's all of us should work for. And especially I think that the US is important in this area. US as a country with a rich history, with a great natural resources, technology, finance, laborious population, and of course, this country plays a major role in this world and may be very important for the future of the mankind, but on the equal terms, on the terms of cooperation with the newly emerging BRICS Union and global majority. I wish I would see it happen. I've waited for 13 years to see BRICS to become a real force in international relations. I hope that the next step, when the West will be included and involved into this process, can come more sooner than that. And good luck to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Toloraya. You are watching the Schiller Institute's International Conference. Let us join hands with the global majority to create a new chapter in world history. And that was Professor Georgy Toloraya, retired senior diplomat and deputy chairman of the Russian National Committee on BRICS Research. His topic was BRICS, a war prevention medicine. Our next speakers are United States members of the International Peace Coalition who are making a call to action directed to the clergy worldwide, but particularly in the United States, where the problem is. They call it a moral policy for peace. We will present two of those contributions now and a third a little later in our proceedings. The first is from Father Harry Burry of Minnesota, a longtime activist for peace. He became a Catholic priest in 1955 and has been on the forefront of all of the anti-war battles in the United States for well over a half century. He is followed by Robert Cushing of the Association of U.S. Catholic Priests.
Greetings. My name is Harry Burry, and I'm a priest of the Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis in Minnesota in the United States. I'm a Catholic priest, as I say, and I believe in faith that God the Father sent his Son, Jesus, into the world to reveal to humans that it is God's will that we stop killing each other. That is why Christ Jesus came into the world, and that's my motivation to be a war resistor. God made this revelation, I believe, by word and example. Jesus made this revelation by word and example. In words, Jesus said, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, do good to those who intend you harm. No exceptions. That means that the triune God wills that Americans love the Russians, love the Chinese, and vice versa, and love the Koreans and vice versa, and others. Anyone who seeks to harm us, to help them get what they need. Seek to satisfy their needs, not to compete with them, but cooperate with them. And if we do that, it will result in peace in our world. Secondly, Jesus came not only to tell us that, but I believe he showed us by his very example. When the night before he was killed in the garden, when they came to arrest him, his associate Peter drew his sword and cut off the ear of the servant of the high priest. And Jesus said to Peter, put up your sword. He who uses a sword will perish by the sword. And then he did good and he healed the person who had been struck by Peter. And then later, when he stood before Pilate, he told Pilate that if God willed it, if his Father willed it, he would send his angels to protect him. But that his kingdom, Jesus said, was not of this world. And so he was allowed to be arrested, and he was sent to the cross to die. And he didn't fight back. He didn't use self-defense. He went to the cross and he prayed for the very people who were killing him. Father, he prayed, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And so I believe in faith that God is willing us people who are followers of Jesus to get this message across to the world. that we are to love our enemies, and it is by loving them and helping them get what they need that we'll have peace in the world. Thank you for listening.
My name is Bob Cushing. I'm a retired priest, resigned priest in Georgia, and I'm struggling to put together what's going on with the present situation on the news and from what I'm reading and what I'm not reading. My father, when I was a boy here in Georgia, back in '62, he was part of the Air Force and took a lead role in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the military response. So I remember that very clearly. And when I see what's going on right now in terms of how we have placed missiles all around Russia, and with the NATO buildup since 1991, we promised the red line thing with James Baker that we won't move 1 inch. We haven't gone inches, we've gone countries after countries to surround Russia with countries that are using NATO weapons, missiles aimed at Russia. And I remember how I felt with duck and cover exercises in the 50s, and the fear that there would be a nuclear catastrophe. And we're closer to that now than ever, I think. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, well, what can one person do who sees the news and they're not talking about the obvious? The obvious is that this unprovoked attack has been provoked by us poking the Russian bear. Now, I'm not one of Putin's favorite people, but we've put a monster's face on him. And so the Russian bear has been continually attacked, and we're the ones that are provoking him. So that he finally pushed out into Ukraine, a nation that has been so unstable for so long, and one that he is trying to claim as a buffer zone, it seems. I think that we've got to point out that this war is our own doing, and we've got to speak out. And I don't know any other way than right now to speak up against things like cluster bombs and depleted uranium, things that are highly immoral and not any part of a just war method. We are involved with a very unjust situation, and we've got to speak up because our media is cooperating with the military and cooperating with the industrial complex that's making a lot of money, it seems, trying all their new toys out on this warfare that's a meat grinder and annihilating 500,000 people already. So as a concerned citizen, I want to speak out, and I want to join with others who would like to speak out, to do something, to say something, to stand up against this horrible situation that is threatening the very life of our planet. We're in trouble, and we have to see what can we possibly do to say, stop, for God's sake, and find a way to work for peace and not for this war machine that seems unstoppable. We must say stop. So that's what we're doing today. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Harry Burry and Robert Cushing, for your remarks. For those that have just joined us, welcome to today's International Schiller Institute Conference. Let us join hands with the global majority to create a new chapter in world history. Now, speaking of speaking out, our next speaker is Ray McGovern, former senior analyst of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, founding member of the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, and all-around troublemaker. He likes to make good trouble. He speaks here often and has been with us many, many times. And while we could give a name for his topic, we'll refer to part of the name, which is making a shift towards sanity on the brink of annihilation. We'll let Ray tell us himself what he intends to talk to us about. So, good morning, Ray. Welcome.
Thank you, Dennis. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're very clear.
Thank you very much. Well, I would start out by saying that how is it that first song went? I don't feel tired anymore. Here it is. Here's a note. I don't feel no ways tired. And I think the inspiration of this group, this gathering today, is so supportive of world peace and so hopeful, given what has happened at the BRICS and at other venues, that it's okay not to feel tired no more. Let me refer back to the fellow who got me down to Washington initially. His name is President John F. Kennedy. He asked those of us who had something special to give to our country to come on down and give it. Now, when John Kennedy addressed the United Nations, it was on September 20th, 1963. He was thinking of these issues. He was talking about the UN rising to its responsibility to help reduce tensions and hold back the darkness. I have come to salute the United Nations, said John Kennedy, and to show support of the American people for your daily deliberations. Whoa. Well, I think most people realize that the UN has fallen into a state of disrepair. The influence of the Western powers, the colonial powers, if you will, is so predominant, even in UN organs like the IAEA, the International Agency for Atomic Energy, or the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. They cannot act honestly because of the pressure they feel from the main powers. Those are recent examples. If you go back to 2003, when the U.S. wanted to attack and invade Iraq on false pretenses, the head of our signals intercept agency, the National Security Agency, sent an email to its British counterpart, GCHQ, and said, we have to monitor, we have to get something on the people in the Security Council because they won't approve this escapade into Iraq, and we have to get some dirt on them so that we can persuade them to approve it. And this applied not only to the permanent members, of course, but to the ones that were filling in the Security Council at the time. That email was leaked. It was leaked before the war, and yet the war started. Suffice to say that it took a couple of years, but the Secretary General of the UN did say this war was illegal. Well, hello, of course it was illegal. What else? Well, I would simply say that no longer can anyone get by with saying, well, we're going to do a coalition of the willing. It doesn't matter if the Security Council doesn't go along with us. We're just going to go ahead and do it ourselves, like, oh, maybe Poland, Lithuania, or maybe we'll fix up Ukraine. That's not going to work anymore because of the BRICS growth, because of the BRICS power, and because the BRICS represent the majority of humankind. This is big. This is not what used to be the case. So there's some shining hope in this area. And I'd like to just add a couple of things from John Kennedy. He talked about the need for peace. At this UN General Assembly meeting there on September 20th, 1963, he said, look, it's never too late. It's high time that disputes were taken off the debating schedule and placed on the negotiation table. Okay. Well, that applies today in spades to the situation in Ukraine. It's necessary to get over the rhetoric and over the debates and get to the negotiation table before the rest of young Ukrainian men fall on the battlefield, and Russian men too. So it's very clear what needs to happen. And what BRICS can do is create a counterweight. Now, can they work through the UN? Well, I would say that Russia and China have been fastidious in not simply brushing aside the UN despite the obstacles, despite the fact that they were deceived, for example, when they were asked to abstain on a measure to keep flights not going in Libya, a no-fly zone. They were deceived. You know what happened to Libya. But they keep on holding the UN up as a legitimate organization despite the problems, despite what's going on. Now, also in this speech, John Kennedy raised the question of a joint exploration of the moon. In other words, here at the UN, he was saying, look, it's not something that one body should do or one country. We should go together and sort of pool our energies, our expertise. There's no reason why we should duplicate our scientific efforts here. Let's go together to the moon. Now, that didn't work out. We know that the US did go to the moon. Now, all this morning is understandably very, very heavy, okay? And so I'm going to break this heaviness just momentarily with an apocryphal story, especially since we hear late news that there were going to be some space shots to the sun. And one comedian said, well, I hope there's no intent to land on the sun. And the other comedian said, oh, don't worry. They're going to go during the nighttime. End of lame joke. Back to seriousness. We have to hold hands on this. We have to give it time. We have to be patient. It was made clear that BRICS was 30 years in the making. It's very much in the making now. Give it time. Make sure that people realize in the world that it's not a case of isolating Russia or China or Russia and China. It's actually the West has self-isolated, and this winter is going to be very cold in Western Europe, and the people there are finally going to wake up and figure out what happened to them. So what I would like to do is say that we need to cooperate on these things, as John Kennedy once offered. John Kennedy is still very much alive in my consciousness. I think his ideas have no expiration date. I think we have to keep trying. And in every tradition, every faith tradition, and I must compliment Father Berry for making this clear. There's an adage which says you're supposed to love your enemies. Going back to Confucius, it was the old adage of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And so we do need to extend and hold hands, not give up, especially with the growth of BRICS and other salutary developments that we can see through the clouds. And I'll just finish by including something that I tacked on to the end of a briefing that I gave at the UN Security Council back in February 21, I think it was. I referred to the bitter struggle between black and white in our country, and how very gifted black leaders rose to the occasion. And through the black-run African-American church liberation movement, justice of a kind, not full justice yet, but justice of great measure was achieved. And the way we do that in our country and the way we do that internationally is to join hands, is to sing the old song, we're going to keep on loving our enemies. We're going to keep on loving our enemies. We're going to keep on loving our enemies. Never falling back. Never falling back. So let's make the effort, you know. There is an adage that the Chinese always use, and that is, let's have a win-win, you know. There's enough in this world to share. Why don't we have a win-win? That would be loving our enemies to the nth degree. Let's hold out hope that we can do that. And with the empowerment of so many people in the BRICS movement and outside, we can achieve a different world from the rules-based international order. One last thought. 2 days ago, Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, got up before the EU Parliament. And he said what he usually says: we have to prevail against the evil forces of the East, and we have to make sure that Ukraine wins this war. And one of the parliamentarians, he was an Irish representative, he raised his hand. And this is what he said, 2 sentences. Mr. Stoltenberg, at the Vilnius summit, it was declared that the Chinese are trying to subvert the international rules-based order. Now, it criticizes China for being opaque. Get that? Opaque about its strategy and its intentions. My first question, Mr. Stoltenberg, is how is it possible to subvert an order, the rules-based order, that has no basis whatsoever in international law? Well, I have to say that I identify with that. What people have to ask these days is, you can't make stuff up, okay? The international rules-based order is who makes the rules? Well, we know who makes the rules. So we have to be upfront. We have to love our neighbors, to be sure, but we have to be very direct in exposing their duplicity as we move forward toward peace, as we hold hands and try to make this a better world. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Ray. And if you've just joined us, we want to welcome you to today's conference of the Schiller Institute. You've just heard Ray McGovern, former senior analyst of U.S. Central Intelligence Agency and a founding member of the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. He was talking about the topic of making a shift towards sanity on the brink of annihilation, something very important for the United States. And continuing in this vein, our next speaker, Scott Ritter of the United States, former UN weapons inspector in Iraq, whose topic is the NATO worldview is colliding with reality.
Greetings from Bethlehem, New York. I want to thank Helga LaRouche and the Schiller Institute for giving me this opportunity to address you. The topic that I'll be touching on is the direction that NATO's taking today. What are the implications of NATO's current posture vis-a-vis the geopolitical
realities of the world? First of all, to answer that question, I think we have to reflect on why NATO exists. NATO was created by Western European powers, a transatlantic community, so to speak, in the aftermath of the Second World War, to stand up against the perceived threat posed by the Soviet Union, in particular its ongoing presence in Eastern Europe. There was concern about the spread of communism into Western Europe by economies and social and political structures weakened by years of conflict. And so NATO was seen as a vehicle to serve not only as a bulwark against the expansion of Soviet power, but also a vehicle to help strengthen democratic institutions inside Europe. Lord Hastings, the first Secretary General of NATO, once famously quipped that the purpose of NATO was to keep the Americans in, to keep the Germans down, and to keep the Russians out. And let's say that he accurately portrayed what NATO was originally envisioned to do. But decades later, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the unification of Germany, and ultimately with the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO lost its reason to exist. The Russians were out. The Germans were no longer down, but lifting themselves up. And there really, frankly speaking, wasn't any reason for the United States to remain in. NATO has done its duty. It had stood up to Soviet pressure. It had prevented Soviet expansion. It had done its job well. It was time for NATO to go. But NATO refused to go. Because you see, it wasn't just a military alliance. It was a political institution. A political institution closely linked to the birth and expansion of the European Union and to American hegemony. NATO is an extension of American national security and foreign policy. It's a tool to be used by the Americans. The Americans weren't going to just simply throw this tool away. No, they sought to transform NATO away from being a defensive alliance and instead to become part and parcel of the American bag of tricks that existed when it came to projecting power, not just regionally, but globally. We saw NATO involved in an offensive war of aggression against Serbia in 1999. We saw NATO involved in a regime change offensive war of aggression against Libya in 2011. We saw NATO get involved in Afghanistan in a nation-building exercise in the aftermath of the September 11th, 2001 terror attacks on the United States, NATO training missions in Iraq, NATO training missions in Syria. We see NATO seeking to expand into the Persian Gulf. And most recently, we've seen NATO, a transatlantic alliance, seeking to expand its presence into the Pacific. Not because NATO or Europe needs to be there, because the United States wants it there. Again, reflecting the reality that NATO is an extension of American power. Nothing more, nothing less. It does not represent Europe's legitimate national security concerns, nor could it, because if it did, it wouldn't be involved in the ongoing conflict against Russia via proxy in Ukraine. Let's look at Europe's economic prosperity that has taken place over the course of the past few decades. Europe recovered from the Second World War. They rebuilt their economies, and their economies, enabled them to underwrite effective healthcare programs, social programs, retirement, benefits, you name it. Why? Frankly speaking, it's for one reason only: cheap Russian energy. Because of the availability of Russian gas, Russian oil in quantity at affordable prices, Europe was able to, over the course of decades, put aside hundreds of billions, if not trillions of euros worth of national resources that could be invested in other places. Had they instead had to pay market value for the energy they consumed, you wouldn't have seen the growth of European industry, and you wouldn't have seen the accumulation of wealth that the European states were able to dole out to the benefit of their populations. But the United States found this to be unacceptable. If the United States was looking out for the interests of Europe, they would have found a way to allow Europe to sustain connectivity with Russia in terms of energy. But that's not what we did. Instead, we sought to cut Europe off from Russian energy. And in doing so, we have destroyed Europe's economy. Today, we see a German industry in free fall. Deindustrialization is taking place as we speak. The same can be said of France, Great Britain, and other European nations. NATO, by these NATO nations linking themselves to American policy, they are destroying the constituent nation states that comprise NATO. Another myth that exists is that NATO speaks with a singular voice. In many ways it does, because the only voice NATO can ever express is an American voice. It may have a Norwegian accent, as it currently does with its current Secretary General, Jan Stoltenberg, or it could have a Belgian accent or a German accent, but it's an American voice. Nobody should be under any illusions otherwise. And the American voice has to project a perception of success, that NATO is a successful organization. But if you look at NATO, you'll understand that the American rhetoric, again, whether it's with a Norwegian accent or otherwise, the American rhetoric that NATO has never been more unified, more strong than it is today, it's empty words. How can an organization claim to be unified when at one of the critical junctures in its modern manifestation, that is going back to 2002, on the eve of the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, you have a U.S. Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, talking about old Europe and new Europe. We have already created a fracture, a dividing point in Europe, saying there are those who are with us, in this case, New Europe, Poland, the Baltic states, the other Eastern European nations that used to be part of the Soviet bloc, and those who are against us, opposed to us, that being France, Germany, Italy, the nations that weren't in alignment with our policies in Iraq at that time. We created this divide, and that divide continues to exist today. But there are additional divides. How can you speak of NATO unity when you have a nation like Turkey, a NATO member, opposing NATO expansion by Sweden and Finland by saying that their policies are incompatible with Turkish national security objectives, namely in terms of their support for Kurdish separatist groups? NATO is supposed to be a common alliance, but one nation, Turkey, has said a threat exists to its existential survival that is being supported by NATO wannabe members. And so they oppose this. Is that unity? Even though Turkey caved in on the issue of Finland, they have yet to say yes to Sweden. And even if they do, it'll be under duress or through a bribe. You know, Turkey was offered, at least some press stories suggest that the United States offered Turkey access to F-16 fighters if they would allow Sweden to join NATO. But then it turned around that Congress is against this. Congress believes that if Turkey is given F-16 fighters, they may use those fighters against Greece in a war in the Aegean. Greece is a NATO member. Turkey is a NATO member. How can you speak of unity when you're concerned that if you provide weapons to one NATO member, they may use it in an armed conflict against another? NATO is not unified. There's talk about NATO expansion. NATO, again, was talking about moving into the Pacific. But that was shot down by France, whose leader, Emmanuel Macron, said, it's a North Atlantic Treaty Organization. There's no reason for it to be opening up a liaison office in the Pacific. Again, internal domestic squabbling in this so-called unified alliance. There's talk about NATO being stronger than it has ever been because of the conflict in Ukraine, that because of the Vilnius summit, NATO has spoken of expanding its military capacity, creating a 300,000 strong rapid response force. But this force exists only in the mind of Jan Stoltenberg and his American masters. It doesn't exist on paper. And there's a question whether or not the failing economies of the European members of NATO can support and sustain the price tag of building this military that Jan Stoltenberg says must exist because of the Russian threat. That leads us to the conflict in Ukraine. NATO has thrown its weight behind Ukraine. Not directly, there's no boots on the ground, but NATO has stripped its armories bare in supporting Ukraine. They have drained their treasuries in supporting Ukraine. NATO has said that a Russian victory in Ukraine would be a victory against NATO. Therefore, NATO can never allow Russia to win, and yet Russia's winning, and there's not anything NATO can do about it. The fact of the matter is that NATO is a failed and failing alliance. It has a limited lifespan. The notion that NATO is going to survive for another 75 years is ludicrous. NATO will be lucky to survive another 5 years, 10 years at the max. NATO is an organization that has lost its reason to exist. Moreover, its European members are starting to wake up to the fact that if they continue to be participants in NATO, that their national security interests, legitimate and otherwise, will be always subordinated to American national security interests, which do not have the welfare of Europe in mind. Again, I remind the Europeans, what has happened to your economy isn't because of Russia, but it's because of the United States. NATO has members on one side of the Atlantic and on the other. The members, the United States and Canada, who are on one side of the Atlantic, don't care about Europe. Europe is not there to be treated as a close ally. It's there to be exploited for their benefit, especially that of the United States. It's time for the European members of NATO to recognize this and stand up and look for a European security framework with Russia that respects the legitimate national security interests of Europe and those of Russia, to ensure that the two sides never again get involved in a conflict, whether it be direct or via proxy. Both sides will prosper. Of course, the United States will be opposed to this. And so the true struggle for NATO going forward is going to be the internal political struggle between the European states and the United States as they wrestle with competing visions on how Europe should participate in a changing global dynamic. The age of the American hegemon is over. The rise of the multipolarity reality is here upon us. And it's time for Europe to decide, do they want to be part of the winning team, and that is, of course, multipolarity, or do they want to go down with the Titanic that is represented by the American singularity? Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to talk, and I wish you, Helga, and I wish the Schiller Institute and every participant in this conference the very best.
That was Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector in Iraq. The NATO worldview is colliding with reality. You're watching the International Schiller Institute Conference. Let us join hands with the global majority to create a new chapter in world history. Our final speaker for this morning's panel, which will be followed by questions and discussion, is Diane Sare of the United States, a LaRouche independent candidate for U.S. Senate from New York. Now, if I'm not mistaken, Diane, in a sense, actually started today's proceedings in that she was the conductor for the Schiller Institute in the performance of the African-American spiritual, I Don't Feel No Ways Tired. There's a serious question as to the intellectual and moral requirements demanded of successful candidates or would-be successful candidates for the high office in the United States. How are these candidates going to be able to recruit people from the BRICS plus nations to help overcome the decades of failure in domestic and foreign policy on the part of the transatlantic world if they can't be trusted? And I think what's important about whatever she was going to tell us is to keep in mind that the issue that is before us, and we'll get into this in questions and answers, is where do we go from here? We have a moment, we have an opportunity, but you also have to have the leadership that's able to take that advantage of that opportunity. So welcome, Diane, and you have the floor.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much, Dennis, and thank you, Helga, for convening this conference. When I was recently at the New York State Fair in Syracuse, I learned that the building of the Erie Canal led to a 40-fold increase in the population of Syracuse. Think about that. 40 times more people moved into that city of Syracuse in 10 years. And that 40-fold increase of population became more and more prosperous with the diverse market that the canal opened up, allowing transport of goods back and forth between New York City and Buffalo. Now, contrast what happened in Syracuse to the statement of the New York City Mayor, Eric Adams, who said a couple days ago, of the 110,000 migrants who've arrived in New York City since April of last year, quote, "Never in my life have I had a problem that I didn't see an ending to, and I don't see an ending to this." This issue will destroy New York City, unquote. I hate to tell you, Mayor Adams, but New York City was already destroyed. It was destroyed in 1975 with the Municipal Assistance Corporation, just as Lyndon LaRouche warned. That's why a city of over 8 million people can't absorb 100,000 more. The city can't even take care of its own population. In 2018, there were 100,000 homeless children in the New York City public schools, and a New York City educator just told me that even before the influx of migrants, 19,000 of whom will be entering the public schools and mostly don't speak English, many New York City classrooms already had as many as 40 students per teacher. Do you want to produce a nation of morons, derelicts, and drug addicts? It's a good way to do it. But why do we need schools? Our nation isn't doing anything. Let me remind you that in 1907, the United States absorbed triple the number of immigrants per capita as we have now entering our nation, even if you combine both legal and illegal migrants. But what was our nation doing? How did we liberate ourselves mostly from the British Empire? Lyndon LaRouche, the greatest American of all time, pointed to the work of the young bastard from the Caribbean, Alexander Hamilton. Having witnessed the horrors of slavery on the sugar plantations of Nevis, where slaves only lived for a few months after being brought over, he was an adamant opponent of slavery. After the revolution against the British Empire was won, Hamilton became our first Treasury Secretary, and he wrote 4 papers which LaRouche often cited and which should be the guide for any American patriot. The paper on the subject of manufactures, on public credit, on the national bank, and then when the bank was under attack, on the constitutionality of the national bank. I suspect that there is not even one high school in this nation that teaches those papers, which were so crucial to the founding of the United States. What Hamilton founded was the means by which human creativity could be deployed to raise the platform of human economy. Certain things were critical, obviously, transportation and energy. Imagine Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, and the Marquis de Lafayette in the middle of the Revolution, standing in Paterson, New Jersey, looking at the Great Falls, planning that these would be harnessed to generate power for a modern industrial city, Paterson, New Jersey, which of course now lies in a shambles, full of crime, homicides, and actually was the home to 11 of the 9/11 hijackers. But what else did we do? We built the Transcontinental Railroad with amazing Chinese workers, in spite of racism against them. They were wise enough to drink tea instead of just water out of wherever, boiling the water, and therefore were very healthy and were a crucial part of that construction. And the railroad was built in the middle of the British orchestrated misnamed Civil War, and the completion of it, and then the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876, even after President Lincoln was assassinated by pro-British agents, inspired the world. American Civil War veterans went to Egypt to create an army and build the Suez Canal. Verdi wrote an opera celebrating the completion of this canal. Was the purpose of this just so we could loot Egypt? Was the Panama Canal built so we could loot Panama? The point is that Americans knew that we were still in a war against the British colonial system, and that eradicating poverty around the world, allowing more republics to flourish, not by invading and overthrowing their governments, but by allowing them to develop what LaRouche would call a full set economy, was the key. This would make it more difficult for the British Empire to run its destabilizing drug and slave running agenda. People say the British were the first to eradicate slavery. What about the British East India Company? So we suffered more assassinations. Garfield and McKinley, both staunch advocates for the development of the Transcontinental Railroad through to Ibero-America. Their plans would never have allowed the nations south of our border to become the drug producers for the British Empire, which was still thriving in certain pockets of the United States, emphatically on Wall Street and with the Boston Brahmins, among others. Then with FDR, we had a return to Alexander Hamilton's principles. And that was no accident, as one of Franklin Roosevelt's forebears, Isaac Roosevelt, had been a collaborator of Hamilton generations earlier. Unable to tackle the unconstitutional Federal Reserve, FDR used the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to issue billions of dollars of credit to construct thousands of new schools, roads, bridges, power plants, post offices, sewage treatment plants, hospitals, and other great projects. Most notably, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which transformed one of the poorest, illiterate, malaria-infested, backward parts of the nation into one of the most productive parts of the United States. Again, as after the Civil War, after World War II, delegations from all over the world came to tour the 16-plus new dams built by the TVA, which allowed cheap, abundant electricity coupled with breakthroughs in fertilizer, flood control, etc., which increased food production in the region and other kinds of production by orders of magnitude. One delegation came from China. The success of the TVA inspired and consolidated their plans to build the Three Gorges Dam. Even Afghanistan built a Helmand Water Authority modeled on the Tennessee Valley Authority. But the British had made sure to prolong World War II so that FDR would not be around to oversee the end of the war and the end of colonialism, which is what he intended. Franklin Roosevelt would never have dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. The FBI and the McCarthyite witch hunts took over the political scene, with Eisenhower a welcome reprieve, and then John F. Kennedy, whom Eleanor Roosevelt came to support and offer advice, became president. Again, President John F. Kennedy revived Hamiltonian principles. We began building again. He also wanted to eradicate poverty worldwide and was a friend of Patrice Lumumba, who was assassinated in 1961, just after Kennedy was elected. Then Kennedy was assassinated. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy were all killed within 5 years of each other. The Vietnam War, which Kennedy had intended to end, was launched full force. The post-industrial flower child, green, anti-human cultural project of the British Tavistock Institute and the CIA became our culture, and we became insane. Just at that time, Lyndon LaRouche began recruiting a hard core of moral, intellectual elites at American universities and later internationally. He decided in 1976 that he had to run for president of the United States. And by 1983, he was Ronald Reagan's back channel to the Soviet Union on the matter of strategic defense. The Soviets rejected LaRouche and Reagan's proposal to jointly develop laser weapons against nuclear missiles, and the Soviet Union therefore collapsed economically, just as LaRouche warned they would. By the late 1980s, the treasonous intelligence agencies and their mainstream propaganda outlets in the New York Times and elsewhere, all funded by Wall Street crooks, had geared up a Get LaRouche task force, not only shutting down LaRouche's Fusion Energy Foundation, his anti-drug War on Drugs magazine, his newspaper, but ultimately jailing him and over a dozen of his associates in what former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark called the longest running, broadest range operation to lay low a political leader in his time or to his knowledge. Perhaps this is why, as the leaders of Russia, China, Brazil, South Africa, India, and so many other nations are finally throwing off the yoke of the British colonial divide and conquer games, Americans have lost their way and are not rejoicing. If we were sane, we would recognize this long overdue fulfillment of the principles of the American Revolution. Instead, we are so bowed down by the rage and frustration of our self-inflicted oppression that we are missing it. But happily, we are a nation of immigrants, and the liars and traitors in the mainstream media and who infest our government agencies will not be able to suppress the news forever. The truth of the rejection of colonialism is seeping in. And I am optimistic that the enemy won't be able to contain it. My biggest fear, other than that we launch a nuclear war to stop it, is that as this stinky old monolith collapses, Americans will be looking at their dirty socks and not at the stars, which is where we have to go, along with our brothers and sisters of the entire human race worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. And I want to thank everybody who's been with us for this entire proceeding. There are many, many questions. And so what we're going to do is bring up people right now who are with us. There'll be Helga, Diane, Ray McGovern, President Ramotar, and I believe Robert Cushing is with us as well. So we're just going to bring people up on the screen. Okay. Okay, great. And so there are many questions, but before we go to questions, Helga, I'd like to ask you any reflections or thoughts you have on what you've heard so far.
Well, I first want to thank all the speakers for your remarks. It's always refreshing to hear voices of reason. I think, I want to really totally agree with Professor Toloraya when he mentioned that the speed of developments is really breathtaking and in one sense much, much faster than what everybody could imagine. And let me just say this sort of personal remark, whenever I hear Scott Ritter talking about or defending German interest more than you hear from the ordinary Germans these days, I always think about this pun about Scott der edle Ritter, which is a pun on the name of Ritter, which means in German knight. So it means Scott the noble knight. So I want to thank you every time you remind the Germans, and Ray McGovern, naturally, you do this also all the time. So that's really all I want to say initially, and I'm looking forward to hear more questions.
Very good, but there's all kinds of things here. So give me a minute. I just want to see, because they're directed to different people. Okay, let's take this one. This is from Manfred Thiel in Germany. The BRICS countries and their expansion is the source for more countries that want to develop independently economically for the benefit of their people. This development worries the USA and its satellites very much, and they will use all levers to stop this development. Which way do we have to go to settle the historic dispute between the nations, and thus the fertile ground for attacks of the enemies of a multipolar world economic order? His Excellency Donald Ramotar just spoke on this, but what steps should the BRICS take to settle the open historical disputes? Couldn't all disputes between nations be sealed or settled with a treaty between nations that includes ending the conflicts? This should include border disputes, interethnic disputes, and similar disputes. However, concrete proposals are still missing, and they have to come from the BRICS countries. So those were the observations that were made. President Ramotar, you have anything that you'd like to say about that, just to start us off?
Just to say that I believe that border issues are probably the most difficult ones to solve. Even when you, speaking from my own experience with Guyana, Venezuela issues, I know for a fact that the late President Chavez publicly on 3 occasions said that the issue between Guyana and Venezuela was a creation of the United States and was not a real issue. Yet it has taken on a life of its own in Venezuela itself, and it is making it very difficult for these matters to be solved. And I think that's why Guyana went to the International Court to see if it could be settled. And I suppose that would probably be the same issues that many countries that got problems with borders are facing because of the pressure from within their own country to get the matter solved. So that is why I believe a mechanism. I was thinking the United Nations, but maybe with BRICS coming into being now, I don't know if it's too early for them to take on something as thorny, as knotty as this. But there needs to find a mechanism where everyone could agree on, and where the decisions would be binding on people, and with to examine these issues very closely and come to a solution, because very, very few border issues internationally were able to be settled by the two countries or so forth that are involved. And if you look too at what is happening in the South China Sea, I think the Americans are very well aware of this type of difficulty, and that is why they're inserting themselves and not giving an opportunity for the countries to sit down among themselves to try to deal with the issue in a rational and reasonable way to find solution. They are aligning themselves, for instance, with the Philippines, offering their support against China and even Vietnam to some extent. That is why Vietnam seems to have a very ambivalent position on the issue. So I don't know if that's why we're saying from us who have friends among the BRIC countries, where we can start encouraging them to find a mechanism to deal with these issues, because these are the issues that can be exploited in trying to reverse the positive tendency that we see that have started at this time. That is what I would like to say initially. Okay.
Anyone else want to comment? Okay, I'll continue with questions. There are many here, and you'll see that there will be some where 1 or 2 people will want to comment. This one is from Ambassador Athenes Boudot, former ambassador from Burkina Faso to Canada, and he asks, what is the difference between the BRICS and the non-aligned movement? Thank you. That's the question. Who'd like to take that? I'm going to give it to the president first, and then ask also for Helga to say something after.
The non-aligned movement was a much broader issue. It was a point in time when countries had just come out of colonialism, and at a point in time when we had 2 superpowers, and many countries felt pressured to either take the position of one or the other side. And it was in that kind of circumstances in the middle 50s when 4 very prominent leaders in the third world, and not so much third world, maybe more middle-income type of countries, came up with the formula of having a non-aligned movement where they will not align themselves militarily. I think that sometimes there is a little bit of, in my view, sometimes there's a little bit of misunderstanding of the non-aligned movement. Many people just feel that it was a neutral body, but it didn't stop countries from taking, let's say, if they felt pressured to take anti-imperialist positions and so forth, but not to be aligned with the military aspects of the two superpowers. That was because at that time you recall too that you had the Warsaw Pact, you had NATO, you had CENTO, you had different type of military type of alliances. So the BRICS, I think, is much different from that. It has, to my mind, it has a more focus on socio-economic type of development and offering another possibility or increasing the independence, because as I've said in my remarks just now, even though formally we have independence, we had a system of more or less neo-colonialism, the different kind of mechanism used in order to continue the exploitation of third world countries. And therefore, the fact that the BRICS have come out to offer, and only BRICS could have done that, these countries like China, Russia, and so forth, the stronger economies could offer another possibility for socio-economic development. So I think the focus, the focus in the non-aligned movement was more not allowing the countries to be dragged into military alliances and to try to take a more independent political position internationally. The BRICS position seems to be a stronger focus on socio-economic positions and offering an alternative to what we have at the dominant system that we have at this point in time, and which is very, very badly needed, because very, very clearly the dominant system in the world is creating a huge set of problems. We have such global problems like the climate crisis. Yet there seems to be no end. Countries are still taking positions that are detrimental to the climate, even though we now have all the consciousness, all the evidence that climate change is real. Wars of aggression, look at what we're happening in order to fight to continue to domination. Therefore, all of this seems to be a need for a new socio-economic system to govern the world. And this is where I believe BRICS offers an alternative to what exists at this point in time. And that is, to my mind, a major difference.
Okay. Helga, any comments?
Well, I think the idea of non-alignment is a very good idea, because I think alliances is really has a negative connotation. As I mentioned earlier, the news came this morning from Delhi that the African Union has been admitted to join the G20, which is therefore becoming the G21. Now, I think that that's still it's a positive step in the right direction, obviously, but it's still a compromise, because if the same standard would be applied to Africa, like to the European Union, which is a full member, but they also have, Germany, France, Great Britain, I think Italy. So by that same token, then you should have at least Nigeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, Congo, South Africa also represented in the G20, but I think that would still not be representative. So, eventually it should be replaced by a G1 or a G all. So I think the good thing about non-alignment is that, it is not aligning with, which has this military connotation. And I think that is very much what is required. I also share President Ramotar's view that the BRICS is a very positive development. And, as Professor Toloraya said earlier, it is open. It would be even open to the West. Now, I don't think recently that offer has been stated emphatically, but I think we have to move to a new security and development architecture, which is open to every single nation on the planet and which represents the interest of each. So that's my comment.
Okay, I'll just indicate that there are now questions for literally each one of you. So what I'm going to do is take a few of those that are directed to various individuals, and it's everybody. So first, Helga, I'm going to start with one for you from Dr. Wolfgang Bittner. And he says this. Here's my comment on today's conference. The best connected networks aim at a globalized private law that is not democratically controlled or world order. The plans are obviously going in the direction of comprehensive digitalization, centralization, and surveillance. This must be prevented, and the focus must be on humane, more appropriate forms of human coexistence. The basic need of people is to live in peace. For this, there are ideas of an economy organized in a humane way, a more reasonable financial system, and a peaceful society based on solidarity. It is all available. The pioneering programmatic postulates of the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, have still not been realized. They must be recalled and demanded in the collective memory: liberty, equality, and humanity. It is to be hoped, however history develops, that these ideas can be permanently enforced. Otherwise, our Western civilization, which cannot be called culture anymore since a long time, is at the end. So that is his comment, and I think he just wanted to know if you had anything in response, Helga.
Well, I think, as for the developing sector, the BRICS, the Asian cultures, I'm actually Africa. I'm actually quite optimistic because, while none of these organizations is fully developed, the BRICS is not, worked out. The other organizations are not yet in a systematic way. But I have found participating in some of the recent conferences. For example, I participated in the Belt and Road Forum, the first one, in I think it was 2017, and there the spirit of the Silk Road was what elevated every representative I spoke with. Then I participated in an Asian Dialogue of Civilization conference where all the Asians were represented, and there I found the same thing again: an extremely positive attitude towards the future based on a cultivation of the ancient traditions, sometimes 5,000 years of these countries. And the mood was very, very much different than, let's say, if you watch the really cold-blooded atmosphere at the Munich Conference of Security, for example, just to give one example. And I think that the problem really lies in the West, because the question if a society goes up or down, that determines really, if people are optimistically, culturally moving forward or the opposite. And what you see right now is Africa, most parts of Latin America that I know of, Asia, these are countries who are all determined to improve, to develop further. And in the United States, if you ask people, what will be your perspective for the next generations, will they be better off or worse? They most likely will say, oh no, they will be much worse off than we are. Germany, you know yourself that the people are really completely downtrodden, desperate, enraged. In Italy, I know to be the same thing. France is famous for the rage which gets into the streets. And I think we in Europe and the United States, we really have to get our act together and do what the Asians are doing very well, what the Africans are doing very well, that we really unearth the best traditions of our own history and actualize that, and from that standpoint determine the future. Because as for the digitalization and similar problems, well, that totally depends on the moral character of the people who are using it, which is why, for example, in China, where you have much more development of digitalization, AI, but the majority of the people are not, they don't feel that they're being exploited and misused by the government through these technologies. In Europe and the United States, it's very different. I believe that the only way, and that's why the Schiller Institute is called Schiller Institute, is the aesthetic education of the individual. Without the moral improvement of each individual, each of us, all of the people around us, there will be no improvement of the political scene. So I think, the biggest effort, I fully agree, since you mentioned the French Revolution, I fully agree with Friedrich Schiller, who, after the Jacobin terror had taken over and, the Jacobins chopped off the heads of people under the guillotine, Schiller said, a great moment has found a little people. And therefore, he developed the aesthetic education as the means to make sure that people would be elevated, and that when the next great moment would come, the great moment would not find a little people. And I think one could even say, now that we have the absolute fantastic great moment of colonialism really coming to an end after 600 years, and there are these people who say, well, but the BRICS is not perfect and we should bet on all of these opposition movement. No, I think really it is the question of how to make this present combination work. This is the great moment, and we should really rise up to be a great people and not miss that historic opportunity again. There's a lot more to be said about that, but I think that should be it for now.
Okay. And what we'll do is, if anybody wants to make a comment at any point, just raise your hand so I can see you. I'm going to go to Ray McGovern. Here's a question we got, Ray. Speaker is unidentified. And they say, I think one of the main problems of the collective West, quote, leaders, is their pathological hatred toward Russia. Could you please talk about the roots of Russophobia in Europe, the UK, and the United States? I grew up in the Soviet Union in a tiny place. We were not taught to hate the West. Instead, we were taught in schools and universities that we could and should coexist. So the person's asking, where does this all come from?
It's a very good question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Russophobia, well, it comes from centuries ago, but most recently from the Soviet Union, which was a threat to our civilization, or seen to be. Now, that dissipated, or should have, after the Soviet Union imploded, okay? It was no longer a threat, okay? And so what happened? Well, why was it all of a sudden seen to be a threat? Well, from 2000 until 2014, Russia was not seen to be a threat to Western Europe or to anybody else. Why? Because they had no military worth the name, and more important, they had no intention to take over countries in Western Europe. Now, you could say that, McGovern. How do you prove it? I'll give you an example. If you're worried about the Russians, what you do is you build up your armies in such a way that you don't run out of shells for your artillery. As you know, 3 months ago, President Biden was told, oh, we're run out of 155 millimeter howitzer ammunition. Oh, and he said, well, let's give him some of ours. And he said, well, we don't have it. We're low too. Well, let's give them cluster ammunitions. Well, okay, we'll give them. I mean, hello. There was no preparation for an attack from Russia because there was no indication that it entered the mind of Mr. Putin or his advisors to attack Western Europe until 2014, we helped to arrange a coup in Kiev. Then it all started. In other words, the Russians didn't like that. They tried to negotiate with the West and it didn't work. Now, all the while, 2014, well, that's 9 years ago. Didn't NATO have time to build up their 155 shells for the ammunition? Well, 9 years is enough time. NATO, the West, still didn't believe that Russia had any intention of invading any part of Western Europe, and that's why they ran out of shells. Okay, I had a comment below one of my articles just yesterday. It said, running out of artillery shells is worse than running out of bullets. Running out of bullets is really stupid. It proves that NATO was not expecting to defend itself from an attack or a war with Russia. So where is this Russophobia stoked? It's stoked by the people who profiteer on selling weapons to places like Western Europe and the U.S. Army and the U.S. Armed Forces. It's a lucrative business, folks. And I'll just close by quoting Pope Francis, who, when he came to the U.S. Congress, addressed a joint session of Congress, what he said was this, I quote, "The most important thing here to address is the blood-soaked international arms trade, period," end quote. Now, what happened? Well, if you pan the audience there, all these representatives and senators, and then they were looking into their pocket to see if the latest envelope from Raytheon or the one from Lockheed over that, well, we're still there. I mean, hello, it was giving hypocrisy a bad name. The arms trade, the arms production, that's the core of this thing, and they are profiteering immensely on the poor people of Ukraine who are dying for all this. Thanks.
Okay, this is a question for Robert Cushing. You'll see how it evolves. It's from Manuel. He says, "Hello, everyone. I'm very grateful to be able to be at this conference." Excuse me, did you have your hand up, President Ramotar?
Yeah, I
Okay.
just wanted to make a slight comment because I think there is a belief that that NATO, and it's implicit in some of what we say among ourselves, that NATO was a defensive organization against the Warsaw Pact or against Russia. But just to point out that NATO was formed in 1949, and the Warsaw Pact was not formed until 1955. So it was the other way around, in my view, that the Warsaw Pact was created to try to neutralize what they felt was an attack. But I think the problem goes deeper than that. It's in a philosophical outlook of the American ruling class. As far back as 1944, you remember that President Truman had made a speech at the Baylor University. And this is what he said. I have it in a note. I found it and I have it in a note. He said that he condemned planned economy, the Soviet Union's planned economy. And he said it was not the American way. And he went on to add that the American system would only survive in America only if it became a world system. So from the very beginning, this idea of making the American system the world system against what any other country wanted to do was present, and that has come down right down the line. I mean, recently, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you remember your old famous Paul Wolfowitz made a statement that was very interesting in the 1990s, even before NATO started to expand. He made a statement, he said that our first objective is to prevent the re-emergence of a new rival, either on the territory of the former Soviet Union or elsewhere. That poses a threat on the order of that posed by the former Soviet Union. This is a dominant consideration underlying the new regional defense strategy and requires that we endeavor to prevent any hostile power from dominating a region whose resources could be sufficient to generate global power. So this is not something that is in passing. This goes from generation to generation, a mindset that they must dominate the world so I think that's the problem. It lies in the in a philosophy of domination by the ruling class in the United States that they feel that they must dominate the world. And for them to dominate the world, they must destroy every other system that tried to pose as an alternative. That is why poor Cuba, a little island, although it has great achievements in many things, and although it has great achievements in science, technology, and what have you, it cannot really show its advantage of the new system that it wants to build because of the blockade that it faced, and the people are suffering tremendously. It would not be allowed to develop on the doorsteps of the United States a strong, vibrant economy to be a showpiece, as West Berlin was a showpiece during the time of the contest against the Soviet Union. So I would just want to clear that up, because even among ourselves, sometimes we say, well, there's no reason for NATO to exist, which we all agree, because the danger to NATO has gone. NATO was the one that posed the danger in the first place. That is just what I would like to say.
Okay, I'm sure that Diane, among others, will have things to say now in response to that. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to Robert Cushing, his question, and then there's several questions. Actually, Diane, you have several people here who are asking. But let me just take this question. I am very grateful to be able to be at this conference. I especially appreciate the tireless work of the Schiller Institute and the entire LaRouche organization for giving a sense of the future and what needs to be done to be better people for a humanity that has not evolved sufficiently. The words of Sister Helga show, as always, the immeasurable beauty of a mind that thinks simultaneously, scientifically, and humanely in the most dignified and beautiful sense. Today, I have a question which at the same time is also intended as a suggestion. It is addressed to all the speakers, but especially to representatives of the Catholic Church, such as Mr. Robert Cushing. Would it be correct to say that indifference should be declared the eighth cardinal sin? Yes, it is a little strange to put it that way, but as has been expressed many times by Mrs. Helga and also by Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, we must not allow ourselves to ignore what is going on in the world. Thank you again. Best regards and a very warm embrace, and that is from Manuel. So, Mr. Cushing.
Manuel, I totally agree with your direction of your question. As some of you know, I was a Catholic priest for 44 years. I left the hierarchy of the Catholic Church with permission of the Pope, and am now a baptized Catholic. Why? Precisely in the direction of your question, so that I could get outside of the hierarchical dominance that is kind of a hegemony on grace. From a theological perspective, it's trying to control or gatekeep the graces. The people are being disempowered by a hierarchy and a parish system that continues to keep them apolitical, continues to keep them basically piously self-concerned with their own salvation and praying, and not being involved politically, not being aware culturally what's going on in the world. So I left the hierarchy so that I might become alive in the lower hierarchy. So thank you for inviting me and allowing me to sort of come out today. Thank you.
Okay, so good. Diane, so there are several questions, as I said. So let me make sure I get, well, I'll put two of them together because it is not fair to do more than that. One is from Valencia Williams. It says, greetings from Ghana, West Africa. So this is a little specific. And she asks, is there a comprehensive plan being developed to incorporate transatlantic countries such as Ghana into the so-called Pacific Mission? I think she's referring to the, well, that's what she says. She talks about the fact that Ghana played a major role in the transatlantic slave trade. And the second was, with the rise of immigrants in New York, would Diane be willing to work with Mayor Adams on a comprehensive immigration plan? Okay, so that's the first question, Diane, from Valencia. And I'll put the other one together and you'll see why. This one doesn't have, this is out of the chat room. And the question was directed to you, and it is, why are the people of the United States not protesting the destruction of their country by obviously incompetent representatives? I think you're muted.
There we go. Okay. I had an enraged dog, but he's been taken care of, so I had to put the mute on. First, I just want to say something about NATO and the shift in the United States, because we are not acting like Americans. And in fact, the rotten policies that are being forced on the world by the pompous, arrogant adolescents, as people may have referred to them, in our government are simultaneously destroying the world and the United States. And you hear people saying, why are we sending all this money overseas when we can't? Yeah, we're sending the money overseas to kill 400,000 Ukrainians, and we're doing the same thing to the American people. It's not a difference. But Elliot Roosevelt, the son of Franklin Roosevelt, wrote his book as he saw it about the conversations he observed between Franklin Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin and others. And the book came out in 1946, okay, not even much more than a year after the end of the war. Why? Because he said everything my father promised, that the British wouldn't be the first to enter Hong Kong, or, you know, all of these things that FDR had envisioned in the post-war world were being undone virtually instantaneously. The breath had barely left his body. And in fact, Fletcher Prouty, in an interview he did some years ago with EIR, with Jeff Steinberg, actually talked about being on an airplane in 1944, which was carrying back American prisoners of war, but discovering in the back of the plane some pro-Nazi Romanians who were being also flown into the United States. So already before the war ended, we were bringing into our intelligence agencies British imperial treasonous interests, the divide that we never quite have won in this country. We're bringing Nazis into policy-making intelligence agency positions in the United States. So absolutely, I think the establishment of NATO was part of this very ugly trend, and I think part of the reason why Americans aren't allowed to know anything about our actual anti-colonial history or thought is because if we did, we would be resonating very strongly with this incredible momentum around the planet. We would recognize in China something very similar to the intention of the founding of our republic, as Ben Franklin clearly did, which is why he published the Analects of Confucius in his newspaper. Now, on Ghana, I think there was a leader, Kwame Nkrumah, who could have developed the proper kind of relationship with the United States had the United States been sane. As Patrice Lumumba, who I mentioned, was assassinated just as Kennedy was taking office. I think that, as Putin said in one of his recent speeches, I think at the Russia-Africa Forum, it's clear that the continent of Africa as a whole, the 54 nations there, are potentially the fastest growth area on the planet. It's criminally insane to try and stop it. And furthermore, it won't work because you have billions of people moving that way. The United States is only about 4% of the population of the world. So really, we should have a little more humility about about what we think we're, and all this talk about democracy, since when is it quote unquote democratic for 4% of the world to impose their will on 96% or 80% or, the nations that don't agree with the policy. On the question of the immigration, the migrants, of course, as a U.S. Senator, I would be willing to work with Mayor Adams to come up with a plan. As a U.S. Senator, I think the first plan would be that the United States has to have a mission for good in the world. A friend of mine brought to my attention recently a paper written by Mr. LaRouche, I believe in 1984 or maybe earlier, The Science of the Human Mind. And he talks about mental health. And he said that the key to mental health is the intention to do good and to live in a nation that intends to do good. Now, in the United States, between the 1960s and present, we closed 90% of our psychiatric beds nationwide. So we didn't even intend to address issues of mental health. And we also became bad. We became a nation with a nefarious intent, as evidenced by the Warren Commission cover-up of the Kennedy assassination and by the witch hunt against Lyndon LaRouche. And finally, I'll just say that it's becoming more and more clear why the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche is so absolutely urgent to the health and welfare of the American people, because everything that he warned about in his economic forecasts and strategic forecasts is unfolding, both the danger of thermonuclear war and the potential that we're seeing now from this BRICS process. And if Americans had access to his ideas, they would be more able to participate in this. Also, we have to end this idea of guilt by association or criminal targeting of political leaders. It used to be the case in this nation that you would have debates of policy, like the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and they went on for 3 hours. And Lincoln was adamantly opposed to slavery, for example, and also the question of the Declaration of Independence and the equality of man came up. He was able to defend his position eloquently. Today, we don't have debates. You're not allowed to simply oppose someone on policy, but you have to have a political witch hunt instead, where no one is even allowed to think through the profound issues facing us. So I think the United States has to change greatly, but the key, as was said in Shakespeare, the fault lies not in our stars, but in ourselves. The fault lies not in the Biden administration, but in the American people, that we are underlings and we have not made our voices heard in opposition to these criminal policies.
I'd like to take, there's one other question directed to Helga and to President Ramotar, but then after that, I'm going to ask if there's any cross discussion, because we have a unique opportunity if people have matters that they've heard and may not have, in a set piece way, be able to respond to them. So here's the question. This is from the Zoom, and it's topical. So it was this. In the light of the military coups going on in Francophone Africa, is it too soon to predict the end of France's dominance of these various African countries? Second part of the question was simply, does anyone have a comment on the recent coup in Gabon? So it was directed in your direction, Helga, first, and then they wanted a comment from President Ramotar.
Well, while one should not underestimate the determination of some powers to remain in colonial control of, after all, it's profitable to run the cartels which exploit the resources from these countries. I think that the tectonic shift which is underway, which was highlighted at the Johannesburg summit of the BRICS countries. I mean, I'm observing these things sort of from a bird's view, and being at the same time in the middle of making the suggestions and programmatic ideas which are contributing to this change. I mean, look, I think there is a process underway which will sweep colonialism for sure, because the reason why I referred in my earlier remarks to the unsuccessful effort following the IDB proposal of Lyndon LaRouche in 75, after 76, the non-aligned movement was crushed because the powers to be came after these leaders with a vengeance. And for many decades, there was not much from the G77, or, they were very weak. But I think that really with the Belt and Road Initiative, which is now 10 years old, and the tremendous opportunity which some countries of the global south have realized, they have now the second largest, or maybe soon first economy of the world with them. Many other countries are moving along, and I have talked to a lot of people from, not in particular now any one country, but several countries, who all expressed that that they really want to be a middle-level income country in the near future. And the way is shown, the way the Chinese overcame extreme poverty, and actually a lot of poverty as such, that has inspired so many leaders. And I think that it's like I have the absolute conviction that what we are experiencing right now, and it's very difficult to say, is it going to be half a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, but we are experiencing the kind of transformation as it was from the 14th century, which was a dark age in Europe, with the Black Death killing 1/3 of all the people from India to Ireland, superstition, scholasticism, just a dark age, terrible time, to the absolute fantastic golden age of the Italian Renaissance of the 15th century. This was also in a relatively short period of time. Why? Because people went back to the sources of humanism. Then you had the incredible events of the Council of Florence, the work of Nicolaus of Cus, the fact that Cusanus was instrumental of bringing the Greek Orthodox scholars to Italy at the time. They brought back all the works of Plato. So it was an explosion of knowledge which transformed a dark age in a very few years, actually few decades, into a golden age which laid the foundation for 600 years of European history. So I think that what we have to conceptualize is that it is such a transformation which is taking place. And I do not think, unless you have World War III, which wipes out every life on the planet, I don't think this genie can be put back in the bottle. Because it's not just the countries which are now in the limelight, but it's other countries, like Egypt. An incredible transformation is taking place in Egypt. Or take Indonesia. I mean, Indonesia is one of the leading countries. It soon will be probably bypassing the German economy in terms of importance. And then there are many other countries. The changes taking place in Southwest Asia right now. Anyway, I'm very optimistic. I think that rather than doubting and saying, "Oh, is this going to work?" I think we should mobilize the populations of Europe and the United States and say, "Look, this is a golden opportunity to, if we would agree on changing the world order, changing." Obviously we need a reform of the financial system, which is bankrupt. Glass-Steagall, National Bank, credit system, American system of economy, all of these things are well tested. For example, the whole reconstruction of Germany after the Second World War with the help of the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, the credit institution for reconstruction, which was modeled on the Roosevelt Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which again was a revival of American system economics. All of these things have been done. It's easy, relatively easy, you know, and when there is a new currency emerging, probably next year, I think that's a very good chance. Why can we not think that we are now in the period of 1 to 2 years where the whole system is going to change? The United States will reconstruct itself. The United States should have a fast train system. Why not build 40, 50, 60,000 miles of fast train system inside the United States, rebuild some cities, you know, which are falling down, build some new cities in the not so populated Midwest, or even more to the west. There are some countries who have almost no population, so you could build new cities there. What I'm saying is, you know, Germany should not be condemned to a country where nothing functions anymore, because, you know, you can't go with the train because it's late, it's not functioning. You can't go with a highway on the highway because there's all the time construction, which takes 10 years or longer. I'm not kidding. You know, Germany used to be a country where everything functions. Why can we not go back and make it functioning again? Italy, you know, Italy is an incredibly creative country in terms of, you know, it has a history of having entire periods where it was excellent. And the same goes for many other European countries as well. So I think what we need to do is exactly what I suggested in the beginning. But also have to force the powers to be to review that they were mistaken in what they did. It did not work. They're running the countries against the wall. So cut it out. Either you change, you reform, you become better, or you should resign. And that should go to the entire political caste, which is now doing all of this damage. And we need state citizens who qualify themselves to be able to discuss these matters in a competent way, which is why the Schiller Institute is doing what we are doing. So I think we are in an incredible period, and people should just be full of energy and optimism to shape history, because this is one of the moments where you actually can do that.
Okay, actually, we have many different, more questions even. We have about 18, 20 minutes left. So, President Ramotar, you have something you'd like to say at the moment? I think you're muted.
Just very quickly.
Oh, no, you're fine. You're good. Go ahead.
Yeah. Just very quickly, I would say that I see this as the beginning of the end of neocolonialism. What we see, the coup d'etat that we see in Niger and the other African countries, I don't very much like the fact that the military gets involved and take political power. I remember one good friend of mine from Sudan once told me that he would prefer a right-wing government, elected right-wing government, and a left-wing military government. But I think what is happening in Africa at the moment with some of these anti-imperialist, anti-colonial coups that are taking place is that there's no other force, I believe, that is organized enough to make the change. And that is why we have the military getting involved. And the main thing that I believe is that there should be some strong movement if it opens possibility for organization to take place where ordinary working people can get organized to try to do a transition to civilian government as fast as possible, which holding a similar line of against neocolonialism and so forth. The other issue, quickly, just to say very quickly, I think one of the difficulties in the developed countries, Europe and North America, in my view, is the strength of the media. That is one of the ways that it has been identified and being used in order to subvert democracy. If the vast majority of people got the right to vote, but in order to ensure that they vote the way that the ruling class wants, they have to control their thinking. And that is what is taking place with the massive media. When you look at the media, many people are conditioned. Their thinking is very much conditioned, and they are made to hate countries because of some of the words that you made to hate leaders. Look at how they talk about Putin. The only thing they need to do is put the horns on his head to try to make him into a devil. So there's a level of conditioning and thinking in which I think there is good signs now, because I see that there's a lot of very popular and very progressive social media that is breaking out, trying to break out of this, and that is now having a very positive impact. So I agree with Helga that this is a very important period in the history of mankind. I believe it's a transition period that we are looking at, but we must not think that it is irreversible. That we used to think that what was happening in the Soviet Union was irreversible. We see that it is not. Nothing is irreversible. What we have to do is create the defensives and continue to work among people to ensure that whatever gains are made we have to make them irreversible until we reach the objective where we have a kind of a situation where really we move from just slogans of being equal and respected to where the reality of that exists at the moment. That is what I would like to say at the moment.
All right. I think what I want to do right now is just give everybody an opportunity, take 10, 15 minutes, which is most of the rest of our time, to just see if there's any remarks or reflections anybody has, or any questions any of you have for any of the others. I see Ray's got his hand up, so let's go with you, Ray.
Thank you, Dennis. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think for some reason we got a blocked image there. What is that?
Oh, okay. Here we go.
Yeah, that's better.
Trying to be,
that's way better.
That better? Okay.
Yeah.
I made some notes here, and I don't know how to do this quite correctly, but what I'd like to do is applaud the inclusion of faith perspectives in this discussion. I happen to think that faith is very important in this whole calculus. I applaud Reverend Berry and Reverend Cushing coming into this conversation. And there was a question about indifference. Now, the tradition out of which all three of us come, that is Reverend Berry and Reverend Cushing, is a Judeo-Christian tradition. And I like to cite the saying of Rabbi Heschel. Look him up, wonderful person. Rabbi Heschel said, look, about indifference, when injustice takes place, few are guilty, but all are responsible, okay? Indifference to evil is more insidious than evil itself. Now, Jesus of Nazareth could have died as a major Hebrew prophet very comfortably in his bed if he was indifferent to evil. He chose a different path. When I was studying moral theology or ethics, the teacher said, it's very simple. You do good and you avoid evil. That was only half right. You do good, of course. You don't avoid evil, you confront it. And that's our job today. 50 years ago, under Pope John the 23rd, there were good enlightened bishops, American bishops in our country, and they issued a proclamation which said, look, here's what we mean by the preferential option for the poor. Ready? No one is entitled to accumulate still more of what he or she does not need, while the rest of the world lacks the bare necessities of life. Again, justice is supreme here. Last thing I'll say is that I also learned a lot from a very, very talented and a very learned Jesuit theologian who went down to Salvador to replace those 6 Jesuits who were killed. His name was Dean Brackley. And what he said was this: my theology is this way. It all depends on who you think God is and how God feels when little people are kicked around. Period. End quote. Bottom line here, justice is supreme. Last thing, a little note here. Ethics professor, friend of mine, gave a big lecture one time, and he started out by saying, I was asked to talk about peace and justice. And I said, no way will I do that. And they said, what? That's your shtick. And he says, no, I will talk about justice and peace because you've got it backwards. Peace doesn't come before justice. Peace, in the biblical sense, is simply the presence of justice. So shalom to all of you. Thank you, Helga. Thank you, all of you, for being part of this justice and peace movement. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ray. Anyone else have anything they'd like to say in reflection at this moment?
Just one.
Sure.
Just one thing to echo what Ray was saying, and that is that apathy is the unpardonable sin. And from the book of Revelation, if you are neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. So if you want peace, work for justice, says Pope Paul VI, and actually a number of other people before him. So thank you, Ray, for your comments. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
We actually have and will play at the end of the proceedings a statement that we have from Pastor Terry Strong, who works with the International Peace Coalition. It's sort of as the transition into the final panel, and she discusses the notion of how does one prevent war. I want to return just for a couple minutes, therefore, to questions, because there were quite a few more, but I just wanted to try to get some things that are most pertinent. Let's see here. All right, so there was a question that came from the German Zoom. Mr. Helmer is asking about Wall Street and the City of London are always mentioned as power centers of the unipolar world. Wall Street is well definable with power in the USA, IMF, etc. The City of London as a power center is harder to grasp. Thanks to Diane Sare for the short historical outline. The British were historically probably almost everywhere in the world and have left their footprint. The influence in today's time, though, is somewhat harder to grasp. How and what can be said in opposition to this, to name and to time, push back? Okay, but I'm not clear what that means. I see here only that the young nation states, which have become more confident and sovereign, and they are breaking away from London, what spheres of influence of the City of London can still be defined? So maybe you should take that, Diane, since they referenced you here, and if anyone else has anything to say, you can add in.
Great. Yeah, I'm happy to, because it allows me to get at what I was thinking, which is the great underestimation of the human mind and human creativity. And this is in one of the 10 principles which Helga outlined, which I think we have to keep in mind because an old order is disintegrating. And what I mean is the perfectibility of man, not that we will become perfect. We are not going to be perfect as long as we are here in the physical domain, but that you have a conception of an infinite perfectibility. People put it in an ugly way. Maybe there's always room for improvement. I would say there's always room for perfection. And what do I mean by that? It means, one, a love of mankind and a love of the idea of growth. There is not a limit to the so-called carrying capacity on Earth. It's a sign of a decrepit, bankrupt system if you feel like you are being encroached upon because someone else is going to get something that you need or you should have. We see that very much here in the United States, where everyone is on the brink of losing their home, having their car repossessed, being unable to feed their pets, being unable to know that their child is safe in school. There's such an incredible sense of insecurity and lack of ability, the inflation to afford even basic day-to-day necessities, that people become very small, and you feel like other people are somehow a competition, as opposed to a sense that we have not even yet come remotely near discovering what there is to be discovered about both our own planet and the universe as a whole. And when you step back and you consider all of those things that you don't know yet, actually, it's a very awe-inspiring thought, and also optimistic, because you realize that there is so much to learn. There is so much enormous room for us to walk in this process of perfection of mankind. So that's the first thing. Now, what is the British imperial outlook? And we use that word, but maybe, I think the Queen used to happily trace herself back to the Roman Empire. What is this imperial outlook? What was the Tavistock Institute trying to impose? What is being imposed with the idea of artificial intelligence, for example? That there is nothing unique about human creativity, that it's a linear deductive process, and that you can control and manipulate people's behavior and thought by using various stimuli, whether it's fear or positive ones like we see with Facebook and different things, where people literally have chemical reactions to getting likes or getting hearts, or if someone friends you or someone rejects you, they're able to actually measure a chemical reaction. And so the idea of these institutions studying human behavior, which is what Bertrand Russell called for, mass psychology, the arrogant idea that you can control the thoughts of human beings, and that human beings are merely some kind of automaton, a beast to be manipulated at will, the herd to be culled when you feel like they're encroaching on your raw materials, and the thought to be controlled. So I think the way we really see this question of empire now is not only in financial policies such as sanctions, such as seeking to deny nations the means of existence, but also thought control, where you induce people to embrace their own slavery, to take the smallness that you are imposing on them as their own identity. And this is not an accident. There's been, I'm sure, billions of dollars spent in studying this and studying how to do this. And that's one reason why I'll just say the question of classical music, of great art, of classical drama are so important, because they give us the means, and scientific discovery, which always overturns previously held axioms. These things give us the means to be fully human and to liberate our thinking from the linear deductive systems that these oligarchical powers are seeking to impose on us. So I hope that helps.
Okay, so we're at the conclusion at this point. I just want to ask or give everybody an opportunity, if you have something you'd like to say that you haven't said, if you don't have to take the opportunity if you don't need it, but if there's anything that you'd like to say in conclusion before we transition to our next panel. So I'm going to start, Mr. Cushing, with you. I think you're muted.
Yes, thank you. I thought Diane was marvelous just now in her summary, and I just want to say amen, hallelujah, go Diane.
Okay, great. That's succinct. Okay. President Ramotar?
I would just like to say, I think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic in what is taking place. I mean, although we recognize great dangers that exist, and they and those dangers are really there and worrying, and something that we have to constantly fight against. But I think that we have a lot of reasons to be optimistic that that the direction or the initiation of this BRICS expansion um, can make can be strong enough, or could be a very beginning of a wave that can probably take us a long way toward the path of economic and social liberation, and give us an opportunity where there will be more cooperation between the countries of the world and the peoples of the world, and less of the type of competition that leads towards with the intention of domination. I think there's a lot of possibility to reorient thinking, that the BRICS have created a beginning for us to re-examine, many people to re-examine their political outlook and their philosophy. One of the optimistic things that I've seen over the last year or two, I recall that when Russia started their special military operation in Ukraine, it was the total misunderstanding that existed in the world. But if you look back from then to now, you will see how much that's changed and how many people are beginning to realize that this is not Russia's fault, as being said, but Russia has this was engineered to push Russia into the position that it had to take, with the hope of destroying it. But so I think that there's the question of the BRICS, the movement of the BRICS, the developments in Africa, in the developments in Latin America, really gives us a opportunity to be more and more optimistic that a better world is possible. This is what I would like to see at this point in time.
Thank you. Ray?
Just very briefly, I want to thank President Ramotar for mentioning Ukraine. I hate to get down to specifics, but that's the focus right now. The thing that could derail all of this are the people in Washington who think they have free rein to shape the world, to include using little mini nukes, little nuclear weapons that are only half the size of Hiroshima, They're crazy. And my concern is that Mr. Putin believes them to be crazy. He has said so explicitly. Now, crazy, arrogant, there's another element here, and that is if the Republican candidate likely wins this election, not only Biden's son, but Biden himself, Blinken, Sullivan could very well end up in jail. The evidence is there to convict them. So, what am I saying here? They have a personal stake in this. They can't lose this election. And that gives an electric aspect to this. What will they do now that it's clear that this celebrated counteroffensive has not succeeded? So I think we need to pray. I think we need to educate all our populaces to make sure that they know, as President Ramotar said, who started this thing, that it was provoked for a reason. And once people understand that, maybe they can see that a reasonable solution is not only possible, but absolutely necessary. Thanks.
All right. Diane?
I will pass to Helga.
Okay. Helga?
Well, I would like to reiterate what was mentioned by several speakers earlier on, and that is that NATO should really be dissolved. They lost their raison d'etre when the Warsaw Pact disappeared. They have transformed from whatever they were into a clearly a agent of domination of the unipolar world conception. And I think that if any self-respecting German would think about the saying, that the purpose of NATO is to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down, I cannot see any good reason why any German would be wanting to be in NATO. So I think we need to do a lot more education about that, and we should really, cause people to want to leave NATO. I think that's a very important issue also in light of the immediate danger, because I agree with you, Ray, that the powers to be don't like to give up easily, and I always thought that the West, if they collapse, which they are in the train of doing, will not do so as peacefully as the Soviets did in 91. So we are in a period of heightened danger until we are in a new paradigm, and I really mean a new paradigm in the sense of that we have to create a better human species. And for that, I think it doesn't really matter if you discuss it from the standpoint of Christianity or other religions and the need to be agapic in terms of the 13th Corinthian, that you can have everything, but if you don't have love, it all means nothing. I think that is the essence of improving the world. And that's why I think the idea of being neutral or indifferent is indeed a capital crime, or a capital sin for that matter, because those who are lukewarm, they are on the side of evil. So I would appeal to all of you, be passionately for the good. You can evoke love if you decide to do so. Just try it. You don't like somebody, try to change your attitude towards that individual and say, I will do something good for that person, which will bring that person further. And you will see that your emotions completely change. So you are the master of your own emotions, and there's no reason why you can blame anybody else if you are an evil person. So improve and join the Schiller Institute.
All right. Robert Cushing, Ray McGovern, Diane Sare, President Ramotar, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. I want to thank you for this panel. I want to thank everybody who stayed with us through the entirety of it. Panel 2 will be starting at 1 p.m., and we're going to conclude with a kind of benediction of the social gospel. This is Pastor Terry Strong, who's a member of the International Peace Coalition of the AME Church, speaking of the prevention of war through the power of love.
Hello, I am Reverend Dr. Terry Strong, and I am from Memphis, Tennessee. And I just appreciate all of you who are participating in this conference. Thank you so much for your attendance. And my talk today will be brief, but hopefully it will be profound and impactful concerning the prevention of war. Thank you, International Coalition for Peace, for inviting me to give my 2 cents worth. And so when we talk about the engagement of war, it is not always inevitable. When some people may think that war is inevitable, but war can be prevented. And if we use the measures of negotiation, of exhausting all means, of reasoning with one another, when we can factor out emotions of anger, of power, of control, those are the things that make countries, individuals, be at conflict with one another. But if we can get to love, it's written in the scripture The scripture says, peace I leave with you. And this is Jesus talking. I am a believer in Jesus Christ. And he says, peace I leave with you. My peace I give you. Not as the world giveth, give I unto you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. The emotions of fear, anger, anguish, oppression, depression, all of those things bring about conflict. And conflict erupts into war. And so, in order to prevent that, the creator of this universe, I believe, he wanted us to be at peace with one another. And so when we talk about negotiations, exhaust all avenues that lead to peace. And when the wheels turn in the direction of war, the wheels of peace and negotiations should make that same turn and go right alongside the actions of war, so that negotiations can stay alive, so that negotiations can have an impact that minimizes the longevity of the war. And so when we deal with war, let's talk about peaceful means before we ever get to war. I said in my speech, the time to talk about peace is before a war begins. And I truly, truly mean that. The time to talk about peace is before a conflict erupts. And that takes intentional being temperate. It takes intentional love and respect for one another. It takes intentional matters of the heart that say, I don't want war. I want to reason with my brothers and sisters. And so I just appreciate the fact that it is my hope that all the wars that are going on, that we can come together, reach out to one another. Those of us who are not physically at war, that we can reach out to other countries and say, how can we help? How can we help negotiate peace between you all? And so I just thank you so much. I pray for those who are in conflict. There's currently 33 countries in conflict with one another. And let us pray for one another and let us pray for peace. And so thank you for your time. I appreciate you, and God bless and keep you is my prayer.